The frozen tundra of Minnesota, central Minnesota. I teach in the philosophy department at St. John's University. I'll do my best to try to sort of talk through my paper in a reasonable way. And the sort of overview of my paper, I'm going to try to build a bridge of a certain sort between honor and liberal societies, or liberalism if you want to call it. I don't pretend that that's the only potential bridge, and you may decide that it's not a bridge between the two destinations that I'm purporting that it's a bridge between, but we'll see what you think. The reason why I think a bridge is necessary is because I don't think you have to look very long or look very hard to see all sorts of examples from traditional honor cultures that seem to go far awry of what people esteem, value in liberal societies. So things like honor killings and the kinds of shackles or fetters that have often been put on some people at their great expense suggest that honor and liberal societies, they make for uncomfortable bedfellows at first glance. And I'm actually going to try to contend that honor and a liberal society, that these notions are not only compatible, but I want to say that a robust sense of honor is something that a liberal society can ignore only at its great peril. And now when I talk about a sense of honor, I should just include that I'm thinking here both in terms of the psychological sense of a person with a sense of honor is somebody who has a deep predilection to measure the self by the lights of things deemed noble or shameful. And then secondly, there's the substantive element of honor in the sense of what indeed is it that someone does honor. So there are both of these components in thinking about honor. So toward the end of Homer's Odyssey, Penelope, she extends this gracious hand to Odysseus. He's in disguise. She has no idea that this is her husband, returned to her after this long, long journey. He's dressed as a beggar. And the unruly, rude suitors, they're treating him with a kind of utter abandon. And when this comes to her attention, she goes to his defense. She protects him. She not only instructs her maids to see to him, but she's careful to say that if anybody else mistreats this fellow, this suitor will have no chance with her. So she goes out of her way. And it's an interesting thing that she does because, after all, she's a higher up person. She could very easily ignore this good-for-nothing beggar, and no one would think twice of it in the sense that she doesn't have any strict obligation to go out of her way on behalf of this person. But she feels compelled to do so, and I want to say that she does so because she's a kind of honorable person who would never think of taking advantage of a vulnerable person in this sort of situation and won't see others do this. She's wise enough to know that the world in which she exists it's a vulnerable place where lives can turn on a dime, and so you could be on top today and you could be on the bottom tomorrow. So that this ought to enlighten your view and ought to keep you from being hard-hearted. Now, the ideal of hospitality that Penelope displays, it doesn't just have a role in Homer's ancient world, but I think in actually lots of disparate times and places, so that in all sorts of cultures, particularly honor cultures, good people, they take great pains to go out of their way on the behalf of people to make their guests feel welcome and comfortable. It's an undeniable gift when people do this, and such gifts, they testify to the importance of the guest. They say a great deal about the character of the giver, and in particular about what matters to them as a person. Now notice that hospitality is not a strict obligation the way that some obligations are. So if I make you a solemn promise, I need to keep that promise. If I borrow money from you, I need to repay that debt. When it comes to hospitality, it's not quite the same thing in terms of being able to codify what anyone might be owed in terms of, say, it being a sort of indefeasible right or anything of that sort. Nonetheless, with a good host, when a good host says that this is my guest, it means something, and something important to a hospitable person. Now, and of course, all kinds of practical considerations can weigh in here. If you're a very poor person, the best that you can do for a guest may be meager indeed. It may be very modest, and in a sense that it's nothing much, but it could end up being all that you have. In fact, gifts in general, I think, in honor cultures tend to be a complicated, tricky sort of business. I have a little example. I won't go into the entire example here, but I used one from the Icelandic sagas, where one character meets an older, esteemed poet. They come to be friends. The younger man ends up becoming quite a good poet too, wins a magnificent shield, and travels to see this older man and finds that he's not there. He leaves the shield as a kind of present, and when the older man comes back and sees the shield hanging over the fireplace, says, "What scoundrel left this for me? Get me my horse. I have to ride after him and kill him." Now, it's probably a touch of curmudgeonly hyperbole in the Icelandic sagas. They are vile in places, but not certain that he actually would have taken the life of this man. But what it points to is that gifts can be complicated things. If one person gives a gift to another person, and if it eliminates the possibility that that person will ever be able to return the gift can actually be humiliating. When it comes to giving and receiving, I want to say that both givers and recipients that have their distinct responsibilities. And so, for their part, recipients should properly appreciate the beneficial things that are done on their behalf. A sense of appropriate gratitude manifests the earnest desire to return good for good. You see this certainly on display in something like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, where I want to say that gratitude, for instance, is nothing short of the flip side of the desire for vengeance. If someone does you wrong, if someone does something bad to you, there's a kind of earnest desire to return bad for bad. Gratitude would be the flip side of this, I think, in the sense of if someone does something good for you, you want to see if you can return it. Now, in everyday life, of course, people may not always be in a position to return good for good. Sometimes it could even be impossible. For instance, you can be duly grateful for the prodigious efforts, sacrifices of your ancestors, or some ancestors who are long gone. And in this situation, the best that you could do would be to be thankful for these people and to be mindful to try to live up to their good example. Now, ingrates, when we think of ingrates in everyday life, these are people who don't have any thought of returning. Whether they fail to reciprocate the people who benefited them, or whether they enjoy the benefit of those who came before them, only to deny the same benefits to other contemporaries or those who come after them. A kind of nice example, I think, of ingratitude, if you know Euripides' Hecuba. Odysseus does not come off very well in this play. As the story goes, Hecuba, the queen of Troy, spared Odysseus' life when he snuck into Troy. And in Hecuba, Euripides' play, the Greeks are uncertain about whether or not Achilles has demanded that Hecuba's daughter Polysena be sacrificed. And some think that the ghost of Achilles has said so, others don't. And it's Odysseus who weighs in the end and says, how important is a slave girl? We ought to err on the side of caution here. We have to do what we must for Achilles. And so he sort of casts the final ballot, sways the group into deciding to sacrifice Polysena. When he goes to tell Hecuba that this is indeed the decision and to collect Polysena, Hecuba reminds him, says, don't you remember? I gave you your life. And Odysseus comes off as a very slimy fellow. He says, I remember what I said, but a man will do anything to save his life. Hecuba is aghast at this. Now, if one is going to say, ask what's so good in honor cultures about things like hospitality, gifts, gratitude, I think one way of thinking about the value of these things, why these are so esteemed, is to first think about other sorts of things in everyday life, the sort of business of living. If I ask you for directions on the street, I assume that you'll answer me honestly. If you promise to come see me at 3 o'clock, I expect that you'll come. If you agree to buy my great fine horse, I expect that you'll pay me. I'll give you back the horse. I think the landscape of hospitality and gratitude is notably different from these sorts of examples. So imagine that I'm a weary traveler. I'm passing through your neck of the woods. It's a hot day. You see that I look like a hungry and thirsty man, and so you invite me out of the sun and into the shade, the merciful shade of your front porch, and you offer me a delicious peach. I pick a peach because that sounds good these days. And a nice cool drink. And I take these things, I enjoy them, and then I leave without a word of thanks. One can get away with these kinds of things. There's nothing to stop me. In this case, I'd say that I am a kind of ingrate. I won't be brought up on charges. I can't be pinned down by people in the sense that I had a strict obligation to either thank the person in a certain way or to go out of my way to return good for good. So it's unlike those sort of situations where if we are breaking our promises or if we are not telling the truth or if we are not paying people for things. In those sorts of cases, to get away with those sorts of things, you usually have to rely on stealth because people can hold you to those things. But I think the landscape of gifts and gratitude, it's a murkier and fuzzier kind of thing. You can get away without doing these sorts of things. It's a lot harder for people to be able to pin you down on these sorts of affairs. Think, for instance, of the following kind of example. I would say that contemporary Americans, that surely we owe a large debt of gratitude to the Allied soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy in 1944. Of course, not many of these soldiers are around to collect the debt these days, but even if more of them were around, it'd be hard to exactly say what such people are owed, so to speak. And we do oftentimes think that way in terms of what people are owed. When people express their gratitude for such things, or when people go out of their way to bestow gifts on people when they don't actually have to, in the sense of that they are obligated to, I think that they testify to ways of life and forms of character that they prize for their own sake. So they effectively say that these things really matter to them, that they cannot turn their backs on ideals that constitute them at what they see as their best, even if they can get away with ignoring such things. So Achilles, I think, would no sooner fail to repay honest, meaningful gifts than he would fail to repay Agamemnon for his terrible insult. Now, and of course, these sorts of things that they can oftentimes just play out as sort of half-hearted or perfunctory manners in everyday life. So it's not to say that we always think of these as such grand things. But if you think for just a moment about, take the person on the street who makes a pointed show of refusing to give me the time of day. I hold a door for someone who walks through it without a word of thanks. In cases like this, I feel like I'm taken for granted, like someone who warrants no attention at all. And so most of us, if we're the victim of such slights, we learn to brush them off. Life is too short to hang on all of these kinds of slights and insults. But I still insist that most people, I think, depend upon some general backdrop of willful giving and thankful taking in daily life. And as the stakes rise, when the things that are given and taken matter a great deal to the givers and takers, or when the giving and taking take on greater import as instances of explicit respect, then this really matters to people. In fact, I'd say that it's not just that we mildly prefer gracious people or grateful people. I think we look down on stingy ingrates. Or at least this is how I think these things look when they become points of honor for people. Now, so suppose this makes sense to you. I think it's undeniable that in many traditional honor cultures, hospitality, gifts, gratitude, that these are important things, points of honor. Now, the next question in my paper here is what to say about a liberal society. Can citizens in a liberal society extol these things as being something that any citizen ought to have? Now, there are lots of things, for instance, that you might think of as important. In a liberal society, you could be a citizen and you could think that poetry and fitness are important, and you could certainly extol them personally. You could say that I think it's a fantastic thing to be a great poet. It's a fantastic thing to be in great shape. But most of us wouldn't think that somehow we should make these sort of citizen virtues, excellences that all people should embody. When people think about liberalism, you know, they often describe it in terms about where the good life is concerned, that liberal society should be neutral to competing visions of how to live and what sort of person to be. Now, I want to wind my way to describing what I take to be three liberal ideals. And the first two I think will be uncontroversial, and it'll be the third one that you might say I'm building a bridge to nowhere. So when you're thinking about, well, what kind of ideals can a liberal society embrace as the sorts of things that any citizen should embody in some sense, I think that liberty and equality are two pivotal ones. If you're dishonest with me, if you cheat me, break your promises to me, speak falsely about me, usurp my power to choose for myself, lord arbitrary power over me, harass and intimidate me, harm me physically, my life suffers badly for these sorts of things. And I'd say if a liberal society is genuinely committed to people being free to pursue a chosen life plan, it has to heed the idea that people have to be able to exercise their liberty effectively. This means more than just leaving people alone. If you're a handicapped person who is bound to a wheelchair, if indeed a liberal society does nothing to try to accommodate ways for such people to get into buildings, such people don't have to be excluded in any intentional sense. So in order to value the liberty of fellow citizens, it might mean not only leaving them alone in certain ways, but also doing something to make sure that they can exercise that liberty in an effective way. Basically, I want to say that, you know, liberty as a value in a liberal society is so important to us because things like, you know, choosing my closest company, my deepest loves, my profession, my personal projects, these things matter deeply to me. They shape a life, and a liberal society's respect for them manifests the conviction that people stand the best chance at flourishing if they can pursue lives that are their own and deeply unfettered in significant ways. Now, I also think that a liberal society has to embrace an ideal of equality, with the idea being that we all count, and we all count the same in some respects. And, you know, without a doubt, human beings have never and never will have the same exact commitment to the well-being of each and every person in all ways. I care about my daughters in ways and to degrees that I don't care about just anybody. But I think a liberal society has to embrace the notion that everyone counts the same in some respects. To take the physically handicapped person again, if you don't make accommodations to make sure that physically handicapped people have access to buildings, it doesn't just offend against the ideal of equality, liberty, but I actually think it offends against the ideal of equality too, because it basically says that this person isn't worth making sure that the person can have access to such buildings. If you think about something like the separate but equal idea in the Jim Crow South, even if it had been true that black schools were equal in terms of quality, which of course was not true, but even if it had been true, it still would have been, I take it, an offense against equality, because it would basically say that we don't wish to have our white children go to the same school with these black children. Now, here's the part that you may find possibly objectionable, but we'll see. These twin ideals of liberty and equality, they're often mentioned in the same breath with another ideal, fraternity. So, for instance, today the French Republic explicitly embraces liberté, égalité, fraternité as its national motto. And I want to think for a moment or two about what the relationship might be for someone to embrace this triad, if indeed you think of it as somehow fundamental to a liberal society. Now, one way to imagine fraternity as a member of this triad, famous triad, is to imagine that you have people who are joined together with a shared commitment to liberty and equality, and because of these indivisible ends, they end up forming psychological bonds with each other. I think this is a common thing in life. If you and I, in some cases, we can share an end, but it's not an indivisible end in any significant way. If you and I need to get across a river and we have one boat, it's wide enough that we each have to have one oar, and the only way we can get across is by cooperating to get us across. We share an end, but it's an end only in a kind of instrumental sense. I might not really give a damn at all about whether you get across the river. I just need you to row so that I can get there. But if you think about other sorts of examples in everyday life, if you and I share a commitment to the Amazon rainforest, or eradicating some kind of disease or something of that sort, in that case, the end that we share doesn't have a irredeemable connection to ourself as us. We care about a state of affairs in the world, and we want to make it so. And when people love what we love in that way, it often ends up generating a kind of sense of common bond. We share an end in a way that's indivisible, but where that indivisibility is a significant thing and not just a kind of incidental thing. Now, that's one way of thinking about how you could end up getting a sense of fraternity in a triad for a liberal society. We share this commitment to liberty and equality, and because of that we come to have some sense of ourselves as brothers and sisters. And I don't mean, when I say brothers and sisters here, I don't mean in some sort of mad flight of philosophical fantasy, but that we have a sense of having some kind of commitment to each other in light of these shared ends. I actually want to suggest that the best way, at least for me, of thinking about a liberal society is to, at the very least, to think of fraternity as first among equals, rather than just being a kind of upshot of sharing a commitment to liberty and equality. I actually think that you should first start with fraternity, and fraternity in a very kind of basic sense, that if we are members of a liberal society, there's a sense in which we share a fate, and you might say that we give a kind of fundamental damn about each other. And it's because we care about each other that this is the reason why we care about the liberty and equality of each other. Now, this may sound like a kind of heresy, perhaps. The remarks may sound like I'm suggesting a kind of conception that's too thick, as it's sometimes said, for a liberal society. But I actually think that you can find examples of this in sort of some of the classic literature. So John Rawls's The Theory of Justice is a great big book. Most people get tired out before they get toward the end of it. There's all the stuff about the original position and such, and so you can sometimes get numbed into insensibility as you're reading along in it.
Never.
But if you think about the kinds of things he says about the social union, and spots in A Theory of Justice where he does talk about fraternity, I'm going to read you one very quick quote, and this is actually about the difference principle. He says that the difference principle corresponds, quote, to a natural meaning of fraternity, namely to the idea of not wanting to have greater advantages unless this is to the benefit of those less well off. The family, in its ideal conception and often in practice, is one place where the principle of maximizing the sum of advantages is rejected. Members of a family commonly do not wish to gain unless they can do so in ways that further the interests of the rest. Now, I'm not bowing to Rawls here as some kind of authority. I'm just sort of chipping this in. If I'm wrong about Rawls, then I'd actually say so much the worse for Rawls here. I know that doesn't sound very humble, but so be it. I think that a liberal society is best viewed ultimately through the illuminating prism of fraternity. As I said, keep in mind that I'm not engaging in some kind of pernicious fantasy, imagining an empirical psychology that we just don't have. I simply mean, again, that we have a stake in each other as fellow citizens. So return for a moment to my example before of the Allied forces that landed in Normandy in 1944, or then slightly 20 years later, the brave people who made the 54-mile march from Selma to Montgomery. Now, I don't think any single thought can adequately capture all the motivations at work for these two groups of people. For instance, keep in mind that hate probably had to be a key part of the picture. Surely the Allies hated Hitler and would see him defeated at great cost. And nonviolent as Martin Luther King and his company may have been, surely they hated Jim Crow without reservation. So hate had a place, but I'd say so too did love. Any picture that leaves out the notion of willing sacrifices on behalf of others that these heroic people cared about surely misses a vital element of their efforts. I think these sorts of sacrifices can only be adequately appreciated against a backdrop of caring about those who stood to benefit from the defeat of Nazism and Jim Crow. And this kind of caring doesn't rely on any strange or unrealistic view of love. Yes. In the end, it has to do, I think, with just the most basic, do you care about somebody else? Now, if this notion of caring, you might ask, is it too thick to serve as a cornerstone for citizens of a liberal society in principle? I'd say if it is, then I honestly don't see any way to get a conception of an attractive liberal society off the ground. If this sense of fraternity is too thick to qualify as a liberal ideal, then suitable ones like liberty and equality by themselves, I think they're just too skinny to sustain any conception, robust conception of a people joined together in any true fellowship. Now, can something less than this kind of fraternal vision possibly hope to survive as a workable society? I'd say most definitely. But I wouldn't underestimate the immense hit that widespread indifference to fellow citizens would entail in such a society. And by indifference, I mean something well short of any kind of outright hostility or anything of that sort. I just mean a pervasive disinterest in the sense of people having little or no intrinsic interest in reaching out to others or returning kind-hearted gestures should others be willing to reach out to them. So I want to say that hospitality, broadly construed as a sense of personal responsibility for reaching out to others generously, and gratitude interpreted as thankfulness for such gifts and the desire to return them when possible, are the very center of our lives as social beings. Of course, there are intimate bonds that we share that do not rely on these. But when you go beyond the kinds of intimate bonds that we have with friends and family and such, I want to say that the kind of social glue that you find with hospitality and gratitude is at the center of our lives. Now, you may say that you can't compel citizens in a liberal society to care about others in these ways, and I'd certainly say you're right. We can hold people to various sorts of behaviors that are reasonably demanded given our ideals of liberty and equality. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that any liberal society that does not end up instantiating a robust sense of fraternity is a worse liberal society. I think the most basic ethical leap that people make in life is the leap from self to others. And prone as we are to make that leap, we all have friends, family, and such. I say that the habits of the kind of humanity that sustain the sorts of bonds that I'm describing, they require abundant and consistent cultivation and sustenance. And this is where I think hospitality and gratitude come in. In many ways, I guess I would say that hospitality and gratitude are the bright side to the undeniable darkness that you see in a story like the Iliad with Achilles, where he feels this deep need to pay back Agamemnon and then ultimately Patroclus. And just as we have this kind of capacity for appropriate anger, and it's a capacity I think that has to be duly cultivated, shaped, moderated, I think the same is so with hospitality and gratitude. I want to say that, this is where I want to try to tie this back to honor now, that honor, I think, is a formidable defense against the kind of calamity that I see of a society that doesn't really value either hospitality or gratitude. A robust sense of honor has to do with things that we deem so important that our very identity hangs in the balance, so that Shakespeare's "If I lose mine honor, I lose myself," from Antony and Cleopatra, I think speaks to the psychological yearnings of the sense. Shame and pride, properly understood as deep measurements of the self, they're two psychological reference points for any sense of honor, so that a shameless person, someone devoid of the capacity for shame, is someone without any functional sense of honor. Where hospitality and gratitude are matters of honor, citizens in a liberal society, I think, just stand a better chance to be brothers and sisters in a common cause. Now, I want to finish up just reading one passage from a lovely novel. It's Richard Flanagan's The Narrow Road to the Deep North. It won the Booker Prize. And it's a fairly long quote, but I think it nicely exhibits some of the things that I'm trying to get at here. The protagonist in this novel is a Australian surgeon, and the novel is largely about the building of the Burma Railroad, forced by the Japanese armed forces in World War II. And the character, Dorrigo Evans, he's not a great man. In fact, in the book he says he hates virtue. He hates when people make a big thing of this, etc. But he finds himself, through just sheer circumstance, being put into a role where he's the commanding officer of 1,000 men. And he rises to the occasion. He realizes that they need a strong, inspiring figure, and even though it's a kind of an impossible figure, and he does not think that he's that man, he somehow pulls it off. But at one point, one of the soldiers underneath him, a cow is stolen, and a steak is prepared for Dorrigo as a kind of tribute to him for being such a leader. And the steak is brought to him, and he's looking at it, and his mouth is watering. He wants more than anything in the world, because they're all famished, they're all starving. He wants to take it in his hands and swallow it whole. But he knows that the men, he has become this kind of legend. He's called the big fella. And he knows that the men, that he has to continue contributing to this vision of him as this noble man, this is the big fella. They don't mean it as a test, but he sees it as one, and so he sends the steak away and says to give it to people who need it more, even though it's the last thing on earth that he wants to do. Here I'll come to the quote now, and this is a scene in which one of the Japanese officers tells him to select 100 men to march from one work camp to another. And Dorrigo doesn't want to do this. But he knows that if he doesn't do the selecting, the Japanese officer will, and he'll do so randomly. And he'll no doubt end up picking all kinds of people who have no chance at all of surviving. So he takes on the task thinking that I'll try to pick the fittest men possible. But he has no illusions about this. He knows that this is going to be a death march. The men that he anoints for this march, they end up surprising him, as you'll see. So here's how the quote goes. And so Dorrigo continued on, up and down the lines of those he had tried to save and now had to pick, touching, naming, condemning these men he thought might best cope, the men who had the best chance of not dying, who would most likely die nevertheless. At its end, Dorrigo Evans stepped back and dropped his head in shame. He thought of Jack Rainbow, whom he had made to suffer so, Darky Gardner, whose prolonged death he could only watch, and now these 100 men. And when he looked up, there stood around him a circle of the men he had condemned. He expected the men to curse him, to turn away and revile him, for everyone understood it was to be a death march. Jimmy Bigelow stepped forward. "Look after yourself, Colonel," he said, and put his hand out to shake Dorrigo's. "Thanks for everything. "You too, Jimmy," Dorico Evans said. And one by one, the rest of the 100 men shook his hand and thanked him. When it was done, he walked off into the jungle at the side of the parade ground and wept. Now, I see the great beauty of this scene, if you see it in the context of the entire novel. It's this tremendous humane nobility of the participants. They effectively, with the kinds of gifts and gratitude that they display, they call out, I think, the best from each other and to each other. Last quick example, I'll do it very quickly. Ernest Shackleton, the great polar explorer, on one of his expeditions, racing against time on the way back, he ordered one of his men to have a biscuit, to eat his biscuit. And this was a man who, at the beginning of the expedition, didn't really like Shackleton, but thereafter had his undying loyalty for the rest of his life. He said that you have no idea what a biscuit, under those sort of circumstances, being ordered to eat it, could possibly do. I'll stop there.